Hello and welcome to the Transparency Report. I'm Jennifer Karchmer. I am the host, the producer, and the creator of the Transparency Report. You can find more information on my website at jenniferkarchmer.com and also follow news reports on Twitter. My handle is journalist_JK. I'm broadcasting live from Seattle on the west coast of the United States. And today I have a special guest coming from London. Her name is Anna Bevan. She is the Assistant Director of INSI, which is the International News Safety Institute. Hi, Anna. How are you today?
Hi. Good. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks for being with us here today. Briefly about Anna, she is the Assistant Director. She has worked as a freelancer in Central America, specifically in Guatemala. She's written for The Guardian and other publications, and she has also done broadcast work and worked for Reuters as well. So I'll let you tell us a little bit more about our background as we go along. Our purpose today is to talk about safety for journalists and photojournalists in the line of fire, in conflict zones and in war zones. INSI does quite a bit of work to help protect and advocate for journalists, and also to talk about the mounting threats against journalists in the last 5, 10, 15 years. This is definitely a trend, and it is quite alarming. And also, why should the public be informed and interested in this topic? It isn't just important for journalists. So let's get started here today, Anna. Thanks again for being with us. Let's start with you, just a little bit about your background and what brought you to INSI.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I was working as a freelance journalist in Central America. And this is a part of the world where local journalists are killed in quite an alarming rate. And so it was something that became apparent to me when I was living there. I sort of read every day in the newspaper about journalists who'd been killed and for doing their work, for trying to get the story out. And it was something that I found quite frustrating, that the rest of the world didn't really react to the situation. And I think that's true of a lot of deaths of local journalists, that it takes an international journalist to really raise the profile and react more to the deaths of international journalists than local journalists. And so it's something that I became quite interested in when I was living in Guatemala and just sort of reading about these alarming statistics. And so when I moved back to the UK in December, I was quite passionate about working with an organisation that worked with journalists in developing countries and conflict zones.
Great. So tell us, if you would, what brought you originally to Guatemala, to Central America?
Well, I was working in London as a broadcast journalist, but I was most interested in international affairs. And so I was speaking to some of my colleagues at Reuters, and they said the best way to get more involved in international affairs and to get onto the foreign desk was to actually go and have your own experience in the international field. And so I originally spoke Spanish, so I decided to go to Guatemala and start working there as a journalist.
Why don't you tell us one or two stories that you covered while there, like what was most eye-opening for you, coming from England, obviously quite a different culture on many fronts. Sure.
Yeah, so the differences, I guess, with the cultures mostly revolved around the topic of insecurity. And so a lot of the issues I was covering in Guatemala would have to do with violence, with gangs, with massacres, with femicides, like the deaths of women. And so some of the stories I did there were about gang violence, massacres, not exactly the cheeriest of stories. Some were about when the Guatemalan government introduced female-only buses for women in the capital so that they wouldn't get harassed on their way to work. And so those were predominantly the themes that I was covering in Guatemala.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, and maybe in a little bit more in the broadcast, I'd like to talk about sort of the day-to-day for you as a reporter in an unfamiliar zone. Let's talk about INSI as an organization. Mm-hmm. It goes back to 2003, 2004. Do I have that right? And tell us really what kind of tone does it set in the journalism industry. In other words, it does partner with quite a few organizations having to do with training and advocacy. But, you know, what is really the big push, the big purpose of this organization known as INSI, the International News Safety Institute? Why is it?
Sure. So INSI is an organization that's run by journalists for journalists. And so we work with journalists in some of the most dangerous countries around the world. And our main issue is safety. So everything that we do relates back to safety. So we offer journalism safety training, which we do with local journalists. So for example, if there are elections coming up, if there's civil unrest, we cover these sorts of modules in the training with local journalists to try and keep them safer, so they can keep telling the news and keep getting the story out, but not risk their life in the process. So that's one of the main areas of INSI, is the training. Another area is our research. So we do a lot of research into media safety. And this is when we partnered with other organizations as well. And then a third area of our work is information. So often journalists will contact us asking for the latest information about a country. So if there's a journalist that's going into a difficult country, they might ask us about border issues, about visa issues, about if we've got any contacts, safe places to stay in that country. So it's all about trying to keep journalists safer.
So give me an example, if you would. Let's say I'm a freelance journalist. I write for the New York Times. I send my work to The Guardian, Reuters, a few other publications. And I'm planning to go to a country in Central America, for example. Would I call INSI for advisories, or what kind of support would I get as a freelancer, and what kind of channels should I go through to get information from INSI?
Sure. So we have a lot of contacts around the world, and so we would then look to speaking to some of our contacts in Central America about the security situation there. Put you in touch with them, look at any advisories that we've written recently on that area that might refer to if there's any medical issues there, if there's unrest, if there are upcoming elections. We're sort of doing some research on that. But we're not just for freelance journalists and international journalists. Most of the people that we cater towards are local journalists.
Okay, let's talk about that. When we say local journalists, because we're hearing quite a bit about threats against journalists, whether they're freelance, whether they work with a corporation, or they're local. Who do we mean when we talk about local, and what are these threats that are mounting against them in certain regimes around the world?
Sure. So local journalists are national journalists. So they would be, so in Guatemala, for example, they would be the Guatemalan journalists who are working for local newspapers. Now with sort of dwindling budgets around the world, you do get a lot more international news organizations hiring nationals to do the work for them. But often local journalists have less safety training, they have less access to good equipment, and they're also paid less salaries, which means that they can't, sometimes they might be looking for a shortcut and won't be able to afford security to go into an area if it's particularly dangerous, or the best security equipment.
Nice. Now, how about in your instance, when you traveled to Guatemala, let's talk about language and culture. Did you already have some Spanish-speaking skills before you went? And what kind of precautions or safety measures did you take when you went? And by the way, were you a student at that time, or you were working professionally?
So I was working professionally. Yeah. So precautions I would take as a female, I would be aware more of where I was going and who knew about where I was going. So I would often tell my partner the area that I was going, what time I was going, who I was meeting, so that somebody had that record. So that if anything was to happen to me, if I didn't come back, that he would know, okay, so she was here at this time. Because often, as a freelance journalist, you're not working with big news teams or in a big team. So I think that's most important, to keep track of your movements and let somebody know. If I was going into a particularly dangerous or potentially dangerous area, I would go with somebody else. So I would see if I could get a friend to come along with me. I often worked with a local photographer there, And so he would come along as well. Just, I think, strength in numbers sort of makes you feel a little bit more comfortable, and that's, yeah, there's more people to know where you're going.
I'm just working with my microphone here, looking like it was having a little tech difficulty. So ahead of your trip to Guatemala as well, what kind of reports were you getting in terms of advisories? I mean, Reporters Without Borders, CPJ, Committee to Protect Journalists, INSI, they all put out advisories by local journalists, I would think, were giving them, you know, that data, that information about safety in particular areas. Was there anything that was particularly alarming? Or again, look, I'm a journalist, I'm in an unfamiliar territory. Of course, I have to take some precautions.
I don't think I read that many advisories before I went, and which is something that now I feel quite strongly about telling or advising other people to do that, to put in the research, because it really can save your life. You know, in particularly dangerous countries, we still have people that are trying to go to Syria or to Libya, and it's really to making sure that you're researching those countries beforehand and understanding that it's not going to be easy. You know, just because you've got good training or you've got the best equipment, you know, that sometimes that's not enough. And so I think it's really important to do a lot more research than I did when I went to Guatemala.
So let's transition a little bit to hostile environment training. Can you hear me okay, Anna?
Yeah.
Okay, I just switched, again, just a little tech issue here with Google Hangout. About hostile environment training, I know that INSI has quite a few partnerships with organizations that offer that. I'm wondering if you personally have taken a training or instructed a training, and what is it that someone, a journalist, freelancer or otherwise, would expect in a training like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've taken part in hostile environment training, and I think the thing that just would be most surprising, or that you learn most about, I think, is first aid. That was something that I didn't actually expect to be covered in quite so much detail. But often, you know, INSI's research has shown that a number of journalists who have died, they didn't necessarily die of a fatal injury. They died because they couldn't stop the bleeding, because they didn't have first aid knowledge, or the people around them didn't have first aid knowledge. And so that's something that's really important, especially when you're going to countries where hospitals won't just be around the corner. You can't dial 999 or 911 and get an ambulance to come in a couple of minutes. You need to be aware of what the most serious threats against you could be in terms of first aid. And so I think that module really surprised me. What else? Things about weapons, sort of understanding weapons, what to do in certain situations, because often it's about mitigating the risk. We can't reduce the risk completely, but it's sort of having that awareness about what could happen if you're covering civil unrest. And it doesn't even need to be in a notoriously dangerous country, you know, as we've seen in the UK and also in the US. Situations can become quite volatile quite quickly. And so it's sort of thinking ahead and knowing what to do. You don't have to be right in the middle of the crowd to get the best shots. You can be standing back a little bit.
And still get the information that you need. You know, just looking at the website for INSI, I was looking at things like type of training and, you know, things that come up. And I encourage anyone to go to the website. It says hostile environment, first aid, chemical, biological, radiological, driving, and then it also says other, kidnap, and ransom. So, you know, this is serious stuff. Then it talks about the equipment, body armor, armored vehicles, first aid and medical, GPS tracking, and communications. This is costly training. I mean, how does a freelancer afford this, or even news organizations? But I do know there are some scholarships available. But yeah, what do you recommend to folks who'd like to take the training?
Well, yeah, there are a number of bursaries available that you can apply through, I think, CPJ and also Rory Peck Trust. They give out bursaries. Also, certain training providers will do reduced rates for freelancers. They know if you're not coming from an organization with a big budget behind it, that they will do reduced rates. And for local journalists, so what we do at INSI is we try and we fundraise to cover some of the training costs. so that then we can take it to people at a reduced rate.
Yeah, that is helpful. And I know in February, INSI was part of a push by several organizations, maybe 25 or even 30 international news organizations that came together to put together some kind of guidelines for freelancers to protect them in the field. In fact, it's printed, I know, on the DART Center for Trauma for Journalists, which is out of Columbia University here in the United States. Did you work on that directly, or you're familiar with what I'm talking about? Any words of wisdom from the INSI standpoint and why that was so important and why it came now? Why not sooner or later?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so we're involved with writing those guidelines. So they're guidelines for freelancers and also for local journalists. And they came about really as an increasing number of journalists who were being killed. A number of these were freelance journalists, which we hadn't seen before. And many people think that the reason why is because of those dwindling budgets that I spoke about earlier. You know, now the New York Times or BBC doesn't have bureaus in every country with a team of journalists there. They're more likely to recruit local journalists or freelancers. And often they don't have the same, they don't feel the same duty of care towards those employees because they're not direct employees. And so they might not check that they have, that these journalists that they're working with, they might not check that they've done safety training, that they have good insurance, that they have the right equipment. And so these guidelines, what they seek to do is to really embed a culture of safety within journalists, but also within news organizations, and get them to take responsibility for all of their employees, whether they're freelance or contract.
You would think that those guidelines would already have been instituted, although what do you think the impetus was for all of those organizations coming together just earlier this year? I mean, it's 2015, and it's no secret for, the last 5-10 years, the increase in the threats mounting against journalists worldwide, freelance, local, and otherwise.
Yeah. So I think really that it's come about this year as a result of the high-profile deaths last year of Jim Foley and Stephen Sotloff. I think the international community has really reacted to that. You know, these were people that were seen as very well rehearsed in hostile environment training, that they had good safety experience, and so it took the industry as quite a shock. And so this was one sort of positive way of dealing with that, sort of looking at why this happened and how we can prevent it happening in the future. So because I think that people need to be aware, or news organizations should take more care of their journalists. And so not necessarily just taking stories from a journalist who's offering one in Syria. It's actually thinking about, okay, it's probably not safe for them to be in Syria, even though they might have a great story. Could they not get out and write the story outside of Syria, or look at a different angle of it, so working on the border or somewhere that's not putting them at risk?
Yeah, and it's no secret that freelancer rates typically are, not necessarily in line with the danger or the rigor of the work that's involved as a journalist. Now, none of us goes into this work to get rich. We do it for a passion and to preserve the freedom of press and freedom of speech. Let's transition to female journalists in particular. I know that INSI has done great work in that realm in terms of putting out a publication and certainly supporting. On the one, it's sort of an interesting topic because on the one hand, talking about female journalists, why do we need to differentiate the genders? But at the same time, there are safety concerns that one might take as a female, or certain threats that one should be aware of in certain cultures. Let's talk a little bit about that, maybe promote one of the publications that INSI has done and some other research that you'd like to mention here.
Sure. So I think it is important to differentiate between male and female training and how genders are dealt with in the press. I think that some of the research that we've conducted with the IWMF, the International Women's Media Foundation, through some of the surveys we've done about violence against women in the workplace or their working environments, has shown that actually women do feel quite under attack, and that they had received most of sort of hostility in the workplace itself. And so they weren't actually sort of in danger. They didn't feel as endangered out in the field, but there was something in the offices where they felt that they were being harassed. And so that was quite important to flag that up and deal with that and talk to, you know, sort of get a conversation going on about that, that actually women don't feel 100% confident or that they're being treated the same as a male counterpart in their own news office. And I think that we also brought out a book called No Woman's Land, which is which we did with UN Women. And so we've got in there extracts, or we've got essays from about 40 different female journalists about what it's like on the front line as a journalist, tips for other women and also for other men, sort of experiences, things that have happened to them, and tips that they've got for other people. And so I think with gender, obviously, with female journalists, there is sexual problems that they are more easily raped and they are more easily come under attack than male colleagues. People often think that they're weaker. And so this is also something, yeah, to flag up and to see what can be done as a result. So as a result of some of our research, we started conducting female-led safety training that was led just by our own female trainers. And then some of the women responded that they felt a lot more comfortable in that environment, because we're not just dealing with local or women female journalists in the Western world, there's journalists all over the world. And so I think that that's important. If people feel like they can talk more freer when it's just in a female-only environment, it's important.
Yeah, there may be instances, depending on the culture, where being a female may be advantageous to getting a source to talk or getting access. But you know, that just comes with the homework that one would need to do for the territory. Just back to Guatemala, was there anything like culture shock related, whether it was as a journalist or just as you know, a Londoner coming to a different country, that really surprised you, or something that you weren't prepared for, or when you got back home, you know, really kind of shocked you?
So I think the lack of diversity, I think that's going there that I really stood out. And so people would stare a lot, and I could never really blend in, which I found quite frustrating, because the UK, I mean London in particular, is so diverse that, you know, nobody sort of bats an eyelid, whatever you're wearing, whatever color your hair is. Whereas in Guatemala, that was quite a culture shock, but I couldn't really go anywhere without people just staring at me and feeling like I didn't really belong there. And I think also clothes, I try to be quite culturally sensitive to the clothing that people wore there. And so to reduce sort of the attention that I would attract. And another thing would just be walking down the street. I think in Guatemala City, particularly, it's a dangerous city. And so I wasn't able just to walk around, talk on the phone like I can back here. And it was quite difficult. But once you adjust to that, I think that the culture, it's quite Americanized in some respects. And so yeah, it was livable, enjoyable.
Wait, let's just go back a moment. When you say even walking down the street, you know, there was a heightened sense of danger. Is that accurate? What do you mean exactly by that? Would it affect time of day that you were out, or, you know, how close you hold your purse, or do you even carry one? You know, where do you keep your ID and wallet? And, you know, what was the behavior how did it affect your behavior in that way?
So I would try not to take a purse out with me, just to keep money, ID, just keep that in my jeans pocket. Just to not put yourself at risk, I think, to sort of reduce that. It's a very poor country, and so with poverty, you know, it breeds violence, it breeds unemployment, and so a lot of people would just be opportunists, thieves. And so if you're giving them an excuse, if you're walking down the street with a designer handbag, then you're going to be putting yourself more at risk.
Yeah, it's interesting, the cultural approach to danger and crime. For example, yeah, I'm from New York, I'm from the United States, and I just traveled to South Africa. And I was in Paris at the time, you know, traveling into Africa. And when I told colleagues and friends here in the United States, their immediate reaction was one of fear. I was flying into Johannesburg. News reports and media talk about it being a very crime-laden city, the airport in particular. crime figures related to rape, very high. And of course, all of these perspectives come from media reports. I happen to have a friend from high school who lives in Johannesburg. So she was, raised in the United States. And we got chatting and I said, what is it I should expect? Is this hype or is this reality? You've lived here for 15 years. And she said, with any reports like that, there is a sense of hype. But I've lived here for 15 years. I love Johannesburg. You take the same steps that you would take if you were out at night in London, if you were out at night in New York. And it's really, a perspective thing. Anything to add to that in terms of, our familiarity with large cities, but then when we travel and we base it on news reports, is there a hype to that? And then we, of course, as journalists and members of the media, it's also our responsibility. How much do we continue to promote that? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely true that media, they tend to publish more negative stories, sort of extreme shocking cases of massacres or murders or rape, sort of these sensationalized things. And those are the stories that stay with people. I think the scare factor, it will stay with you. And so I think that definitely has its part to play, because not all areas in Guatemala City are you're not going to get robbed in every corner, but I just think there are more dangerous places. And so it's just, taking precautions. But I did find it surprising sometimes when pitching to media, to some newspapers back here, that sometimes they did want a positive angle. You say, we've covered massacres, we've covered femicide, we really want something positive. And so actually the article I wrote about female-only buses was in response to a pitch I wrote about femicide, and was quite surprised that actually the foreign editor at the particular newspaper wanted something slightly more positive. Says, okay, this is terrible, but is there anything that the government is doing to counteract this, or anything positive that we can highlight? And so that really surprised me, because usually the positive stories that I would pitch would never really get accepted.
Yeah, that's a good point. And again, it shows the power of the media in terms of the perspective that we present. Is it all gloom and doom, or are there positive stories to be had in certain cultures? Let's talk about impunity. This is an important word in our field, but in particular related to mounting threats. So maybe I should go back. Let's talk a little bit about the trend in international journalism right now. It's no secret, based on numbers that we get from Reporters Without Borders, CPJ, INSI, that the threats are mounting against journalists, being kidnapped, detained, targeted, murdered, and killed. Whereas, and this is before my time, I believe that journalists could wear a jacket that actually said press on it and be in a war zone and cover a conflict and was respected and even protected. Whereas today, journalists are not wanting to identify themselves as a moving target. A little bit about that from INSI's standpoint, why are the threats mounting? And then we'll shift into impunity and, what does that word mean exactly?
Sure. So with some research that we brought out earlier this year, it's called Under Threat. It looks at sort of the changing state of media safety over the past decade. And so with our findings there really show that there is this definite sense that, a decade ago, 20 years ago, the press were well respected. They were seen as impartial. People would wear a jacket saying press and people would leave them alone. Whereas now, I don't know any journalist that would write press across their jacket. And I think the reasons for this are many. One is because killing journalists has become a weapon of war for terrorist groups. They know that they can get a lot of coverage from this, that if they do kill a journalist, that they're going to be in the headlines. I think that journalists are seen as less impartial now because they work for organizations which are affiliated with a certain political agenda or with a certain business agenda. And so people associate them with that and think that they're no longer neutral, that if they work for a certain organization, they're only going to be one to set a certain organization's stance or to defend a certain political party. And so I think that has something to do with it as well. I think another factor is that people don't need journalists as they did before, because they can get their own story out. You know, if you've got a smartphone, if you've got Facebook, Twitter, you can get your own story out. Whereas before, people really relied on journalists to come and then tell the story. And one other issue perhaps be the technological advances. So people can see before, when a journalist would go to a country, they would interview somebody and then they'd publish the report or publish the article, and the person who they interviewed may never have seen that article. Whereas now with technological advances, you can see what's been written about you. And so I think it creates more hostility towards journalists as well, if they think they've been misinterpreted or if they don't trust the direction that they think the journalist is going in. So I think those are a few factors that we saw in Under Threat about why the press isn't treated as neutral as it was before.
Yeah, that's a nice encapsulation of those 4 points. Yeah, excuse me, and I'll add to, it's unfortunate, the truth of that third point about the not needing journalists as much. I mean, I'm a journalist, but I will readily agree that it's true. Internet is not available throughout the world. There are places where you can, but with the technology, anyone who's got a connection and lives in certain cultures has the freedom. Now, you know, let's be honest, there are a lot of places where, you know, the internet is censored or you don't have that freedom. You know, we're looking at journalists and bloggers in places like China and Vietnam and around the world who've been detained and are imprisoned because of their criticisms of government. So it is a blessing and a curse in that, as you're saying, the technology is allowing those reports to get to the source. They don't agree with it, they don't like it, then they'll suppress it. But at the same time, it is a freedom that we are able to provide feedback. I mean, on a little more benign way, I mean, I've worked at newspapers my whole life. In the 90s, we didn't have social media. So maybe you'd get a letter to the editor or maybe a phone call if someone didn't like your local news story. But now on the internet, there are comment sections. So again, blessing and a curse. It's important that the public is allowed to have that feedback, for sure, freedom of speech. But it does mean another level of responsibility for us writers and journalists who are disseminating the information.
Sure, yeah, and it can also lead to female journalists in particular getting attacked online. So at a conference I was at recently, there was a young journalist there from Azerbaijan who was saying that her Twitter feed was just constantly full of people attacking her because they'd seen they can contact her directly and try to silence her and try to scare her into stopping writing what she was writing.
It's certainly a level of intimidation. I mean, it's a real fine line between the freedom to provide feedback and criticism, but also to intimidate and censor. Let's transition that now into impunity. This is, it's an important word. You know, what does it mean exactly? Let's put it in plain English. And why is it important when we talk about these threats to journalists? They're not just being threatened and censored, but those who are the perpetrators are not being accountable, and therefore there are no deterrents. That's my understanding.
Yeah. So impunity relates to justice for somebody who's been attacked. So where the government gets involved and actually prosecutes a perpetrator. And this is a particularly a problem for killers of journalists, because we've seen with our research that 9 out of 10 cases have impunity. You know, where journalists are being killed, perpetrators are so rarely brought to justice. And so it there's no deterrent for people who come afterwards. You know, they see, okay, this person wrote this, somebody didn't like it, they killed him, nothing happened to them. You know, so then they would perhaps go and do the same thing in the future. And so there is quite a lot of organizations that advocate for justice for the victims of, especially of journalists, because it is important to set that deterrent and reduce the numbers of journalists being killed.
So you're saying, based on your research, probably coupled with CPJ and Reporters Without Borders, 9 out of 10 instances, so 90%, those perpetrators, alleged perpetrators, are not being brought to justice. There's a real lack of accountability there. let's throw in, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. So I'm a member of the public, and I say, you know, James Foley, who was an American journalist who was killed last year by ISIS, allegedly, had been kidnapped at least once or twice before while covering Libya and on some other international assignments. Some criticisms, some critiquers would say, you know, journalism, it's inherently a dangerous profession. If you're going to the Middle East or other dangerous places, of course, those are possibilities. You know, why should there be organizations that are going to protect you further if you're going to be kidnapped and detained in your profession? Then you're just asking for trouble. What is your response to that from an organization like INSI?
Well, I think that freedom of expression is so important towards building democracy that I think that that's the key why these journalists are there, because they want to get the story out. Often those people who are being attacked in a country, they can't get the story out. And so journalists feel a sense of responsibility and obligation to go in and try and help. And so I think that, yeah, although they've sort of signed up to this role, that doesn't mean that that they should ever be attacked or that they should be killed because of the profession. You know, journalism, it's not a crime. Nobody should be imprisoned or killed for simply trying to get the truth out.
Journalism is not a crime. Yes, that's an important statement to make. In fact, that was part of one of the campaigns that I've seen online, you know, these awareness campaigns. Let's talk about some of the partnerships that INSI does have, or I suppose relationships with organizations. I've mentioned CPJ, which is Committee to Protect Journalists. It's based in New York. I'm on their email alert list. You know, you put your email in there and you receive emails throughout the day. Literally every day I receive 3 to 5 updates on journalists throughout the world threatened, detained. Occasionally there is a positive story about a journalist who has been released, or that there has been a story that, you know, brings someone to justice. But I mean, my inbox, actually, it's overwhelmed. I'm a journalist, and I cover freedom of the press, so I want to know about this. But they're a busy organization. Reporters Without Borders as well. I'm also on their email alerts. I'm receiving that all the time. Is there ever a point, and I'll say INSI as well, with its advisories and does quite a bit of research, but those other organizations really are on alert. Is there ever a point where there are too many of these organizations? Is their work overlapping? Is there a way to have them working in different arenas, or is more better in terms of creating policy or awareness? What's INSI's stance on that, Anna?
Yeah, well, I think that we would say that more is better if it means that less journalists are going to be killed, if it means that more journalists who are imprisoned are going to be released. I think that can only be a good thing. And while there might be slight overlapping, I think that's where partnerships can come into place, and for organizations to try to work together and bring both of their expertise to reduce overlapping.
Yeah, and I'll mention briefly too, because I'm also a volunteer with SPJ, which is Society of Professional Journalists. It's a nationwide organization here in the United States. It's really our largest industry or professional organization for journalists. And it really does focus on the United States, but does have an international community and discusses these types of issues. And one of the issues that came up recently by our SPJ president was, how often should SPJ put out a press release or some kind of media alert when an American journalist has been kidnapped or detained or killed or threatened in some way? Is it overkill to put out alerts, let's say daily or weekly? And also, does it feed terrorists' actions by bringing attention? Has that been a discussion in your newsroom or your office? And you know, what are some of the thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think there is the possibility of saturation if you're constantly sending out alerts, but it's difficult to know what exactly each of your readers wants to hear. So it might be that something for you might not be as interesting as something for somebody else. And now that it is so easy to send out information at the click of a button, you know, you can receive an advisory. So I think that's difficult for organizations to sort of weigh up how much information and they're sending out. And so they don't want to completely overwhelm and drown people in advisories. But at the same time, you want people to have access to information. You want to keep them safe, or you want to keep them updated on the latest occurrences regarding press freedom. And in terms of giving audiences or giving terrorist groups more of a media presence, I think that is a factor that has been discussed in a lot of newsrooms. But at the same time, if what they're doing is so terrible and it is resulting in the loss of lives, I think that it's important to get that message out there as well.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting topic. I know we're looking at that at SBJ. Certainly don't want to overlap too much work by other organizations, but actually strengthen those messages. That would be really important. We've got a few more minutes, and then I'm going to transition to another section here. I always like to bring in sort of the next generation of journalists. I've worked as a university professor in journalism and would like to continue to encourage students to choose journalism as a major or to study and educate themselves as much as possible. Any thoughts from you on your education? You know, what really hit it home for you to become a journalist in your training, and then maybe a bit of advice for young people who are thinking about it as a profession, whether they're in, you know, the UK, they're in the US, or throughout the world?
Yeah, sure. So I think that it's true that there are reducing jobs. There is a reduction of jobs going into journalism, but I think there are also more opportunities. I think that some people think that journalism is narrowing, but I think that it can also be the opposite. Now, you know, even conducting this Google Hangout, this program here, is something that we wouldn't have been able to do 10, 15 years ago without a lot more technology and equipment. So I think there are definitely still avenues and jobs for journalists out there, and I'd encourage people to go into the profession as well. I think that it's just finding, you know, what you're passionate about, and I think that now you can find out who the audience is for that as well. When I was in Guatemala, I wrote for quite a lot of online publications that were solely interested in Central America. And I think that before, maybe 10, 15 years ago, I wouldn't have even known that they existed if their offices weren't in Guatemala City. And so I think that the internet has opened up opportunities as well in that sense. And as far as advice, I think that just determination. I think that that's the best, one of the best skills a journalist can have. Just keep, you know, knocking on those doors, keep going. It's determination.
Nice. I would concur there. Why don't I give you a moment to tell us, or to tell viewers, where they can find INSI research? What is the website? What is the Twitter feed, Facebook, things like that? And maybe promote some upcoming research, because you put out quite a few reports throughout the year. Is there something that's upcoming in the next couple months?
Sure. So you can find more information about INSI at www.newssafety.org. And so that's our website, where we put out a lot of information, articles from journalists about journalism reports as well. And you're quite right, we bring out at least two reports every year, which is a sort of an analysis of journalist casualties. So we brought out one in July, looking at the first 6 months of the year in terms of journalist casualties, what countries they came from, what sort of news they were covering, and if anybody's been held to account for their death, that sort of thing. Our Twitter feed is INSI News, so at INSI News, and also we are INSI on Facebook as well. So if you can get any information from us on those three.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Well, what I'd like to do is make a little transition now to another segment. I like to call it Jennifer's 5 W's and H, which this, of course, is structured after the who, what, where, why, when, and how of good news writing. And I'm just going to ask you a few questions that require either a good memory or just a one word or, you know, a few word response or whatever comes to mind first. Let's start,
Sure.
Anna. Who was your most influential teacher?
My most influential teacher was my English teacher at secondary school, Mr. McNeely.
Oh, great. He'd be happy to know that. In what way was he influential?
I think just opening my eyes to different things. I think it's difficult to say how somebody has influenced you. I think sometimes they just do. I think supporting you, sort of believing in you, pushing you as well. I think that he was a teacher that really pushed me to achieve sort of the best of my ability. And so, yeah, I say inspiration is to him.
Well, if he's still with us, be sure to send him the link to this broadcast, so he'd be proud to see you working on behalf of journalists. So what are you reading these days? Book for pleasure, or are you just reading INSI reports?
No, I always try to read for pleasure as well. So I'm currently reading Bill Bryson's A Short History of Everything.
Oh, really? Great.
Yeah, which is, I think, has become very dated over the last couple of months as more sort of discoveries about Pluto have come about. I think this mysterious planet that he describes it as in one of the chapters isn't so relevant anymore. But yeah, it's interesting. I love his work, and so I'm reading that, yeah, for pleasure at the moment.
Oh, great. He's an interesting writer. He's a fun read. When did you realize that you wanted to be a journalist?
I think when I was around about 13 or 14, when we had to do a presentation at school on what we wanted to do when we were older. And both my parents are teachers, and so all I knew was that I did want to be a teacher. And so I was looking into other avenues, and my uncle is a journalist. And so I started doing a little bit of research and found, yeah, that it would be a really interesting career. And I think that that's true about journalism. You know, you're never bored. There's always so many different stories to cover and different areas that you go into. So that really interested me. I like variation.
So two parents who are both teachers, and you didn't go into education. I'm sure you had a very good education then. Where were you on January 7th, 2015? And this, of course, is the date in Paris where the Charlie Hebdo newsroom was attacked.
Yeah. Yeah, so I just moved back to England. So I was in my my mum's house and just reading, I think first on Twitter, reports that were coming out. So then I put the TV on, and they were just, there was coverage of the supermarket. And yeah, it was just sort of addictive viewing because it was just crazy that something like this would be happening in Paris.
Yes. Yes, very important news to know about, you know, coming from a place like France, which we don't typically read about in the reports as being a dangerous place, but in 2015 it is.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's important that the public watch a broadcast such as this, or read reports on INSI, or otherwise be interested in the state of affairs of the profession of journalism?
Because I think it's important to know what's going on around you. I think a lot of things are now interconnected, and we can see how they're interconnected in ways that we weren't able to before. So I think it's important to know, to be in a certain country, because you as an audience and as a consumer act a little bit on that. And so, for example, if you're aware of what's happening in Honduras, good things, bad things, maybe you can influence those in your consumer habits. And so I think that's important. And just to generally to have an understanding of what's going on in the world and some of the stories behind this. When it comes to journalists, you know, you'll read the story, but actually knowing what the journalist went through to get that story, or who he wasn't, or the people that he's describing. I think that that's all very important.
Very good. And lastly, just for fun, how old were you when you learned to ride a bike?
I think that I was probably very young. I have two older sisters, and so when I was growing up, I always wanted to be doing what they were doing. And so this would mean that when I was sort of 2 years old, I think I didn't want to wait for my mum to chop my food up for me. I didn't want to wait sort of step-by-step approach. I wanted to be doing what my sisters were doing. So I don't have an exact age, but I imagine I was very young.
Are either of them journalists?
Yeah, one of them is a teacher, and the other one is a journalist. So yeah, mainly for sports journalism. So she works in tennis and equestrian.
Oh, nice. The journalists won out among the sisters. Well, Anna, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you'd like to add or touch on related to INSI, the state of affairs in journalism, or any other topic that we didn't touch?
I think we've pretty much covered it, but just, yeah, for people to get in touch with us, to follow us on Twitter for the latest of what's happening in our field, and so that hopefully we can keep more journalists safer.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you very much for being our special guest today. It's Anna Bevan, who's the Assistant Director of INSI. Again, it's the International News Safety Institute. And thank you everyone who is watching live. And thank you to those of you who will log on at a later date. Please do continue to send this link around to family, friends, and colleagues, whether they're journalists or not. Of course, what Anna said is true, that it's important that the public support journalists, but also have an awareness of freedom of the press, because it really serves as a barometer to all freedoms and how free a culture is in terms of the right to information. This is Jennifer Karchmer for the Transparency Report. Thank you again very much. You can find more information on my website at jenniferkarchmer.com, and also on Twitter. The handle is journalist_JK. And I wish everyone a good day. Thanks again, Anna.
Thank you.